All right, let's talk about A Royal Experiment, The Private Life of King George III by Janice Hadlow, a 2014 work of nonfiction. It was published, probably its original title in the UK, which is The Strangest Family: The Private Lives of George III, Queen Charlotte, and the Hanoverians, which is probably the more accurate title, though A Royal Experiment and The Strangest Family are both good descriptors of this book about George III, the third of the Hanoverians on the throne of England. This is the first book by Janice Hadlow, former BBC television executive, was sort of in charge of the history, arts, that sort of side of things. Produced a lot of shows that way. Has a BA in English. Was a for a time a was a researcher at was and had for a time was a postgraduate history researcher. This is her very first book. She has actually published two books, the other one being a novel, The Other Bennet Sister. This is a really impressive, really quite massive. You can't tell because it's the ebook, but I think the text of this biography runs 618 pages in the ebook form at least. So yeah, it's outlining the private life of King George and his family, and the Hanoverians who came before him. George III, born in 1738, died in 1820. He was also, in addition to being the king of first Britain and then what became the UK, was the Duke and Prince Elector of Hanover, and then from 1814 onwards until his death, the King of Hanover, even though he never ever actually visited that area. He is, on this side of the pond, is popularly known as the tyrannical king, by at least by the Yanks, as the tyrannical king that they rebelled against and broke away as colonies to form the United States. By me, I guess, he's known for The Madness of King George, which is a 1994 movie that was based on an Alan Bennett play. I think he actually also adapted it with Nigel Hathorne from Yes Minister as King George III, and Helen Mirren as his Queen Charlotte. That was my very narrow knowledge going into this. I picked this book up because Sean the Book Maniac had been going on about this book and how much he was enjoying it, and I think it was one of his definite 5-star books of last year. And for some reason, I thought, okay, I'm not really much into royalty, but it sounded like it was a really well written, interesting book, and that I would pick it up and give it a try. And I think I started off with a little sample and went, oh, wow, this is really pacey and it's got some interesting stuff. I'll continue on with it. So yeah, George is the third of the Hanoverian Georges. The Hanoverians were brought to England. George the First was brought to England when Queen Anne died without any issue, so was succeeded by George the First, who is a second cousin of the House of Hanover. George the First spoke only German. Both he and the George the Second, English was not their first language. They were mostly like really Germans in a lot of way. It's when you get to George the Third that you get someone who is actually his native tongue is English and is much more seen as the English king. And yeah, as I said, he never actually went and visited his Hanoverian properties or possessions that he had. So yeah, the very start of this book starts off with, because George III has kind of a different idea of family and a different idea of royalty that he is presenting. The book starts off by outlining what his forebears, what George I and the Second were like, and very much kind of the old school. We're above the sort of the morality of thing. Maybe best exemplified by George the First, who, before he became George the First, when he was simply over in what was going to become Germany, had a first wife who arranged marriage was probably unsuitable marriage, at least on a personality thing. She was accused at least of affairs, probably did have affairs, and was ended up divorced and then imprisoned for the rest of her life. 30 years in prison, all the while he is the first king of England, and his wife, or his former wife, is imprisoned in an out of the way castle somewhere where very limited access. It's sort of one of these like, holy crap, just locked your wife away, which gives you sort of the idea of exactly what kind of life. And indeed, they had the two Georges before have incredibly contentious relationships with their heir, the Prince of Wales. What seems to be a thing of almost a structural thing, that the Prince of Wales, the heir apparent to the English throne, is someone who has no power and is held in sort of stasis, and as a result seems to invariably migrate over to the opposition parties in the House of Parliament, and makes a great nuisance that way, opposes their father. It seems to be almost like structural, that they end up hating each other, and it's really, really this is really, really this is really, really protracted between the various Georges that came before George III, where children are snatched away from the Prince of Wales and held, or just complete battlefield. It's a terrible life. And George III, when he comes in, he is his father is Frederick, was a Prince of Wales who died before he could become king. Uh, Decides to kind of come up with a different way of being. A part of this is that the time that George III is going to be his reign, which is a pretty long one. You get the revolt and the loss of the U.S. colonies. You get the abolition of slavery in the empire, something that he very much supported, and the French Revolution, where you have what's probably the the primo superpower of the time. It's like if the United States suddenly stopped being a democracy in our time, it would be that kind of level of thing. God, really hope I do not get to experience those times, but it's that kind of earth-shaking destabilization of like, what the hell is going on in this world, is all the stuff that's happening at this time. And George seems to be he and his father Frederick are very kind of aware that what royalty, especially in Britain, is very much changing. They do not have absolute power anymore, and it becomes a thing of, maybe it's not political power that they're going to wield, but it's going to be a moral power, and it's going to be the moral power of the royal family, that instead of being above morality, is actually going to be the example, the leading light for morality. And that it's with that kind of view that George chooses a wife for himself, Charlotte, who is of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a duchy in northern Germany, very kind of minor, not messed up in all the politics there, not messed up in any politics in England, which is why he wants to get a wife outside of that, because if he picks a wife inside, then it's you're picking a side, basically. It seems to be the thing. He also wants a wife that has absolutely no interest in politics, because there were wives before, but not for him, but for others, that seem to really stick their oars in and interfere with the king's influence in that. He wants a wife who is completely subjugated to his will, which seems to be something that he has inherited from the Georges before him, of very much demanding, like it's like an almost kind of insane level of subjugation, of ego destruction from their partners. It is quite striking for all of his affability and kind of gentleness that he has. He also has a very hard line on women are like, his Charlotte will have nothing, and that this will come up again with his daughters. There's very much a feel that you get in this book of celebrity, of this is the royalty as celebrity, the original celebs, and how much the pressures of always being watched are something that is influences how these particular people develop. We talk about celebrities today going slightly insane because of they've got all this beaming at them. Now just imagine, from the very moment you're born, there are eyes on you at all times and everything is getting reported. That is the level that is happening here at, at an age before, sort of stuff like the mass media, though we actually are getting like the printing press and stuff like that, where there's much more of this kind of sharing happening and stuff like that. So yes, marries Charlotte. Charlotte, who has, over the course of their marriage, 15 children. It seems to be about a 20-year period in here where she is continually giving birth to children. And this is a time when it is pretty dangerous for women to be giving birth. And, oftentimes it kills them. That she actually survives all this is amazing. There's also just the thing of, she seems to be somebody who is a very intelligent woman, a woman who is really interested in intellectual stuff and in trying to make her own little salon, but having to juggle that with her duty to her husband and to this now her country, to be the obedient wife who sucks down any of her own ideas and stuff like that, to just go with what George is going to give, and to raising their children. And it's really interesting. The other things that are coming up in this era are the ideas of a new idea of childhood that comes. A lot of this comes from Rousseau and his very influential work on the idea of child rearing, and that this is something that actually, revolutionarily, the parents should actually be involved in. Before that, it's like, no, you just you ferry that kind of crap off. It's like, no, this actually should be something that the parents should be involved in. There should be some kind of level of warmth and caring given to the children. Now, there's kind of debates on exactly how different this was from beforehand, of things, of how much you can overstate that, but it was definitely a new intellectual idea, and Charlotte seems to have been somebody who had books by Rousseau and others who were influenced by Rousseau into these ideas. So there's the political stuff of happening with kind of kinghood. There's the political stuff happening with the kind of just becoming a moral authority versus an absolute monarchical authority. And there's this idea of childhood. Now the thing with both Charlotte and George III is they seem to be very warm and caring people to their children as children, but as they grew up, they also have this very much side of duty. You have to do stuff for duty, and everything, any of your personal desires need to be subjugated towards that. And they had what seemed like impossibly high standards towards their children, and a real reluctance to ever actually give them praise for anything, but an eagerness to correct them when they did wrong, which led to some really messed up children also, who are completely surrounded by this bubble, being observed at all times, being fed, the young guys being fed all the money and all the rope to hang themselves, because they're royalty, that they get all the power and all the advantage, and it just kind of ruins them as people to a large extent. That's the males. The females are the princesses are kept incredibly cloistered, and there are really interesting chapters in this book, especially through the viewpoint of one of the ladies of the salon, or whatever it's called, Fanny Burney, a diarist and novelist who served with him and has extremely kind of compelling, vivid descriptions of exactly how incredibly boring and tedious and stultifying the lives of these women were. Jane Austen is kind of the more near the end of George III's reign, that maybe she would have been in adulthood, but this whole idea of just this horrible dystopian world for women, and it was quadruple that, thousands times that for the princesses, in this incredibly controlling world where their father, who for all how much he loved them so much that it was like, no, I'm not going to marry any of you off, which is usually what's expected of kings. It's like, no, I'm keeping you all so you can take care of me. It's like there's this kind of, I am the ultimate monarch and ruler of this land, and I am the ultimate controller of all you children and what you are going to do. And so sucks them in, does not marry them off, keeps them in an arrested, uh, you know, childhood, well into their middle age. It's just like, it's kind of just hellish that way. On the male side, uh, almost all the men, all the boys are sent off almost immediately, into dispatched into the far ends of the empire, kept away from the child, their native, their home, whether they wanted or not, whether they begged to actually be allowed to come home or not, except for the eldest, the Prince of Wales, who will become George the First, who is just basically kept there, not allowed to actually have a profession, who, like all the princes of Wales, ends up gravitating towards the opposition and making as much trouble for his father as he can, drinking, mistresses, which the other, you know, it's interesting, the two sides of, you get the princesses who are kept under this iron stultifying control, and then the males who are just released in almost a kind of neglect, that are just seem to run riot, or just kind of the worst kind of rich, spoiled, rotten creatures, who also have their good sides. This book is really good at showing kind of good sides of someone like the Princess of Wales, while at the same time thinking it's like, oh my God, this is the most asshole, rich bastard that you would ever meet. And into all of this mix, George in 1788, I think he'd had instances earlier, descends into this mania. Is It's like it's a gigantic mental break. He is talking nonstop. He is raving. He is being sexually inappropriate. And this goes on for like 89 to from 1788 to 89, and they're trying to figure out what the hell to do with him. They're trying to bolster this regency bill to hand power over to the Prince of Wales. But there are politics, because the Prince of Wales is allied with the opposition, very closely allied with the opposition, and the dudes who are in power at the moment, the politicians who are in power at the moment, know the second we hand it over to him, he's going to toss all us out, because that is the power that the king does very much still have at this point. I maybe overstate him just being kind of a moral authority figure. He has the power of appointment, and one of those powers of appointment is the power to appoint the government of the day, regardless of, you know, who's getting elected and stuff like that. But this he goes through this period which puts everyone through hell. It's when the head of your entire government is completely non-mental compass. It's like it really throws everything up on a personal and political thing, putting horrible stresses on Charlotte. The Prince of Wales is trying to kind of maneuver as well, and there you can see maneuvering on both sides. They're trying to limit his powers on the politicians, and Charlotte are trying to limit his powers, because yes, they have a horrible adversarial relationship, Charlotte and her son. So it is a complete mess. He comes out of it. Now, is this a mental illness? That seems to be now the theory. At one point, it was porphyria, which is a liver disorder, which can cause some symptoms like this with discolored urine, which there were some reports of, but that seems to have been kind of put to one side as the actual dominant theory at the moment. It's one of these really hard things to say. George III and all of these people are well documented. I mean, that's the great thing about this book, with these long, compelling chapters of the different hunks of the story here, that that Hadlow is able to construct, that you've got so many accounts, so many reportage of what's happening from moment to moment, because they're always under the microscope here. So he comes out of that one, and we continue on. We continue on with like the stories of the princes and the princesses, and what happens to them. Some of the princesses, I sort of end up cheering, because some of them actually are able to kind of make a life for themselves as they go along, despite George III's. He passes a law to basically says he has approval over any marriage and stuff like that, and will, if disapproved, they don't happen. And indeed, there's cases of people having secret marriages just to kind of get around stuff like that. Um, there's definitely kind of the tragic portrait of Charlotte, Queen Charlotte, in this book, as somebody who was such an intellectually interested person, kind of bright, lively person, kind of slowly kind of ground down by all this, becoming a really unpleasant person to live with. Her daughters not wanting to be with her, just trapped with her at the end. I have to say, there's a part of this book of just how controlling and disapproving but loving George and Charlotte are to their children, which it's like a nightmare of, I love my parents, but I was happy to, as I needed to get out at a certain point. And it's like, what happens if you never could get out and they had absolute power, and that power, in a sense, kind of turns them into a bit of monsters that way. And you can't help but see that George III was very much against any negotiations with what became the U.S. Those colonies, for can we come to some kind of accommodation. And politically, he is like, no negotiations whatsoever. He shut anything like that down as much as he could. And you can see that political stance played out within his family as well. The depictions of treating George for his madness, his mental illness, is quite horrific of the time of, this is obviously well before any medications, and just what was considered, good behavior. It's like humors and horribly blistering legs, doing horribly painful things, or treating him like a prisoner and beating him when he misbehaved. Then this is the king, and so you can't imagine what anyone who was of a lesser rank, what kind of treatment they would have received from doctors like this. Even if they would have gotten it, they would have probably just gotten locked up and chained somewhere. There's so many ways that this book, and just the thing at the end is just the idea of celebrity, and the idea of using royalty as this kind of celebrity as an example, which really does get, we go through George III, whose two sons, George the Fourth and then William the Fourth, both take the throne. But then we get to Victoria, who is the daughter of Prince Edward, who is the fourth son of George III, and she does become kind of the moral exemplar of the Victorian age, and that idea of royalty as the example of the figurehead, leading by example. And even today, with the monarchy today, and just kind of how we glom on to celebrity, and how we fixate on it, and how we use it gets used that way. And I mean, even myself, of just kind of projecting my family idea of family onto this strange family. And I guess all families are strange if you can look hard enough. And I mean, just Hadlow just does such a great job of weaving this complex, really sad portrait of these people who are both pathetic and horrifying. And if there's anything that makes you think, it's like, wow, I would never want to be royalty, this has got to be it. This has got to be it. Vive the revolution! Not that that's any better. So yeah, that is my many thoughts and my long and rambling talk about The Strangest Family, or A Royal Experiment by Janice Hadlow. More videos later.